The coffee shop smelled like burnt expectations and second chances. Sarah Chen stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, hardly recognizing the woman staring back. Oversized glasses that had belonged to her grandmother. A shapeless cardigan 2 sizes too big. Hair scraped back into the kind of bun that screamed, "I've given up." She looked exactly like someone who didn't want to be noticed. And that was precisely the point. Her phone buzzed with a text from her best friend, Maya. "You look ridiculous. Why are you doing this to yourself?" Sarah's fingers trembled as she typed back, "Because I need to know if anyone will see me before they see everything else." 3 failed relationships had taught her a brutal lesson. They'd all started the same way. Flowers, compliments about her appearance, promises whispered against her skin. They'd all ended the same way, too. Once the men discovered she worked as a kindergarten teacher making barely enough to cover rent, not the Instagram influencer or trust fund baby they'd imagined. The last one, Derek, had actually laughed when he'd picked her up from the elementary school. "I thought you were joking about the teacher thing," he'd said, already checking his phone for his next match. So when Maya had insisted she try one more dating app, Sarah had agreed on one condition: the worst possible photos. No makeup, bad lighting, the kind of pictures that made people swipe left without a second thought. If someone matched with her anyway, maybe, just maybe, they'd be interested in something real. David Sterling III had swiped right without hesitation. Now standing in this coffee shop bathroom, Sarah wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. What if he didn't show? What if he took one look at her and walked out? What if... "Sarah?" A voice called from outside. "Your date is here." Her heart hammered against her ribs as she pushed through the door. The coffee shop was moderately crowded for a Saturday afternoon, filled with the usual mix of laptop warriors and weekend readers. She scanned the room for someone who matched. David's profile picture, brown hair, kind eyes, a smile that seemed genuine even through a screen. She found him at a corner table and her breath caught. He was gorgeous. Not in the overly polished way that screamed money, but in a natural, effortless way that was somehow worse. He wore a simple navy sweater and jeans, but even Sarah could tell they probably cost more than her monthly salary. When he saw her, his face lit up with a smile so warm it made her chest ache. "Sarah?" He stood immediately, extending his hand. "I'm David. It's so great to finally meet you." She shook his hand, waiting for the flash of disappointment in his eyes, the subtle shift in expression that said he'd been hoping for someone different. It never came. "I already ordered you the caramel latte," he said, gesturing to the steaming cup on the table. "I hope that's okay. I remembered you mentioned it in one of our messages." Sarah sank into her chair, disarmed. "You remembered that?" "Of course. You said it was the only thing that got you through parent-teacher conferences." His eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. "How did yours go last week?" "You were worried about having to tell the Hendersons that their son had been starting food fights." She stared at him. They'd exchanged dozens of messages over the past 2 weeks, but she hadn't expected him to remember the small details, the mundane pieces of her daily life. It went better than expected, actually. Turns out the kid just wanted attention, because his parents are going through a divorce. David's expression softened with genuine concern. "That's heartbreaking." "How's he doing now?" And just like that, they were talking. Really talking. Not the superficial first date dance of impressive achievements and carefully curated anecdotes, but real conversation. David asked about her students with an interest that seemed authentic. He laughed at her stories about crayon-related emergencies and playground politics. He listened, truly listened. When she talked about her dream of eventually opening a literacy program for underprivileged kids. "That's incredible," he said, leaning forward. "What's holding you back?" Sarah felt her cheeks flush. "Money mostly and time. And the fact that I can barely afford my own rent, let alone program space." She immediately regretted the admission. Here she was, dumping her financial struggles on a first date like some kind of charity case. But David didn't flinch. The best dreams are usually the hardest ones to achieve. That's what makes them worth pursuing. "That's very optimistic of you," Sarah said, unable to keep the edge of cynicism from her voice. "Let me guess, you're one of those people who believes anything is possible if you just work hard enough?" David's smile turned rueful. Actually, I've learned that hard work is important, but luck and privilege play a bigger role than most people want to admit. He paused, running a hand through his hair. I work in venture capital. I see a lot of startups, a lot of ambitious people. The ones who succeed aren't always the ones who work hardest. They're usually the ones who had the right connections, the right timing, the safety net to take risks. Sarah blinked, surprised by his honesty. That's refreshingly un-American of you to admit. He laughed, a real laugh that reached his eyes. My therapist says I have issues with inherited guilt. You have a therapist? Doesn't everyone? He paused. Sorry, that's a privileged thing to say, isn't it? I'm working on that too. Despite herself, Sarah smiled. There was something disarming about his self-awareness, his willingness to acknowledge his own blind spots. She found herself relaxing, letting her guard down inch by inch. They talked for 3 hours. The coffee grew cold, then was replaced with fresh cups. The afternoon light shifted through the windows, painting golden squares on their table. David told her about his work, carefully avoiding specifics that made Sarah wonder if he was hiding something. She told him about her childhood, growing up as the daughter of Chinese, immigrants who'd sacrificed everything so she could have opportunities they'd never had. My parents wanted me to be a doctor or lawyer, she admitted. They were devastated when I said I wanted to teach kindergarten. My dad didn't talk to me for 6 months. Do they understand now? David asked gently. They're getting there. I think they finally realized I was serious when I turned down a corporate training position that paid 3 times what I make. Now, she shrugged. Money isn't everything. Something flickered across David's face, an emotion she couldn't quite read. No, he said quietly. It's not. As the sun began to set, David walked her to her car, a 15-year-old Honda that looked even more pathetic next to the sleek vehicles in the parking lot. Sarah waited for the judgment, the subtle distancing that usually came when men realized the gap between their lifestyles. Instead, David said, "This is one of the best first dates I've ever had." Really? Sarah couldn't keep the skepticism from her voice. Even though I showed up looking like a librarian who gave up on life? David's brow furrowed. What? You look... He seemed genuinely confused. You look like yourself. That's what I liked about your profile. You weren't trying to be someone you're not. Sarah felt something crack open in her chest. Most guys aren't looking for authenticity on dating apps. Most guys are idiots, David said simply. Then, hesitantly, can I see you again? She should have said no. She should have recognized that this man, with his expensive, casual clothes and his venture, capital job and his easy confidence, was from a completely different world. She should have protected herself from the inevitable disappointment. But when she looked into his eyes, she saw something that made her want to be brave. Yes, she whispered. Over the next month, they fell into an easy rhythm. Coffee dates became dinner dates, became long walks through the city. David never suggested expensive restaurants or exclusive venues. Instead, they explored food trucks and neighborhood bistros, places where they could talk without pretense. He met her after work, waving at her students who giggled and whispered about Miss Chen's boyfriend. He listened to her vent about difficult parents and budget cuts and the 1,000 small heartbreaks of teaching. And Sarah slowly began to realize something terrifying. She was falling in love with him. She still didn't know much about his life outside their dates. He was vague about his work, dismissive about his apartment, evasive when she asked about his family, but she told herself it didn't matter. He showed up. He listened. He saw her. Until the morning, Maya burst into her classroom, phone thrust forward. Sarah, please tell me this isn't your David. Sarah took the phone, squinting at the screen. It was a news article. Sterling Industries heir pledges $50 million to education reform. The photo showed David, her David, in an expensive suit, shaking hands with the governor. The article identified him as David Sterling III, son of billionaire industrialist David Sterling II, newly appointed CEO of one of the largest private equity firms in the country. Sarah's hands went numb. Sarah? Maya's voice seemed to come from very far away. Did you know? She couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. The classroom spun around her, crayon drawings blurring into abstract smears of color. He was a billionaire, a billionaire. And she'd shown up to their first date looking like someone who'd given up on life, because she'd wanted to scare away men who only cared about money. The irony would have been funny if it didn't hurt so much. Her phone buzzed. "David, can I see you tonight? There's something I need to tell you." Sarah stared at the message, 1,000 thoughts colliding in her mind. He'd lied to her, or at least he'd hidden the truth. Why? Was this some kind of game? Had he been slumming it with the poor kindergarten teacher? Getting his kicks from playing normal? Or, and this thought was somehow more terrifying, had he been testing her the same way she'd been testing him? That evening, Sarah dressed carefully. Not to impress, but to armor herself. She needed to face this conversation as her authentic self, whatever that meant. David was waiting at their usual coffee shop, the same corner table, the same nervous energy she'd seen on their first date. When he saw her, his whole face transformed with relief. "Sarah, thank God, I was worried you'd seen the news article." She slid into the chair across from him. "Where you're identified as a billionaire heir?" His face fell. "I wanted to tell you myself." "When?" The word came out sharper than she intended. "After another month." "Another year?" "I was scared," he admitted. "Every time I tried to tell you, I thought about what you said on our first date. About money not being everything. About wanting to be seen for who you really are." He met her eyes. "Do you know how rare that is? How many people see a dollar sign instead of a person?" Sarah's anger wavered. "So you lied?" "I never lied. I just didn't correct your assumptions." He ran a hand through his hair. The gesture so familiar it made her chest ache. "My whole life, people have wanted things from me. Business deals, investments, connections, access. I never knew if anyone actually liked me, or if they just liked what I could do for them." "So this was a test?" Sarah said flatly. "No, yes, maybe at first." David looked miserable. "But then I got to know you, and you were so real. So passionate about your work. So determined to make a difference despite having so little resources. You didn't want anything from me except conversation and coffee. Do you know how extraordinary that is? And what about me?" Sarah heard her voice rise. "Did you stop to think about how I might feel when I found out?" "I dressed ugly on our first date." "David, I deliberately made myself unattractive because I was tired of men who only wanted me for my looks or who disappeared when they realized I wasn't rich. And the whole time you were—" She broke off, blinking back tears. "The whole time I was falling in love with you," David finished quietly. "Not despite how you looked on that first date, but because of it. Because you had the courage to show up as yourself. Because you valued authenticity over attraction. Because everything about you told me you were someone who cared about substance, not surface." Sarah felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble. "You can't just— I know I should have told you sooner. I know I messed up. But Sarah, everything between us has been real. Every conversation, every laugh, every moment, that was me. The real me. Not the heir or the CEO or whatever other label people want to put on me. Just David, the guy who thinks you're extraordinary. The guy who wants to support your literacy program. The guy who's fallen completely in love with a kindergarten teacher who changed his entire perspective on what matters." "I don't want your money," Sarah said, but the words came out as a whisper. "I know. That's why I'm offering it." He reached across the table, stopping just short of touching her hand. "Not as charity, not as some billionaire playing savior, but as someone who believes in your dream, as someone who wants to help you change lives, as someone who loves you." Sarah looked at his hand hovering near hers. She thought about the past month, about every conversation and every moment of connection. She thought about how he'd never once made her feel less than, never flaunted wealth or status, never treated her dreams as small or insignificant. She thought about her own test, her own fear of being valued for the wrong reasons, and she realized they'd both been looking for the same thing, someone who saw beyond the surface to the person underneath. Slowly, she reached out and laced her fingers through his. "I love you too," she said. "But if we're going to do this, no more secrets. No more tests. Just honesty." "Deal," David said, and his smile was brighter than any diamond. 6 months later, Sarah stood in front of a converted warehouse in the heart of the city. The sign above the door read Sarah Chen Literacy Initiative. Inside, 30 underprivileged children were learning to read. Supported by fully funded programs and passionate teachers, David stood beside her, no longer hiding who he was, but using his resources to amplify her vision rather than overshadow it. They'd learned to navigate their different worlds together, building something new that honored both their values. "Thank you," Sarah said, squeezing his hand. "For what?" "For seeing me. Even when I tried so hard to be invisible." David pulled her close. "You've never been invisible? You've always been exactly what I was looking for. I just had to be brave enough to look past everything I thought I wanted." As they walked into the center together, Sarah realized that sometimes the best love stories don't begin with love at first sight. They begin with the courage to be seen exactly as you are, and the wisdom to recognize when someone else is brave enough to do the same.